So reverb is a subject that really interests me. And it was the first subject I actually spoke about in a big acoustics event here in Mexico City. So I think I figured a way to explain reverberation in a much more detailed way so that it's easier for you to really listen or improve your listening skills and know what you're moving around and what could be the consequences if you want them or not in your sound. Let's just jump into it straight from Mexico City. My name is Juanchis, and let's talk about reverb. Okay, so we're going to go through different audio examples, but the first idea I want to share is that probably the best guide or the plugin that I ended up using the most for explaining reverb was the stock reverb on Ableton Live, because it really separates all of the stages and stuff that happens during the reverb generation. So conceptually, let's talk about something that is only what's happening. Like, I don't care about plugins that have ton of things built under the hood and that marketing uses these or those words. This is the actual definition of what's going on. So whenever you're generating an impulse, an acoustic impulse inside of a physical space like this room, and most of the people, to explain that, do this clap and they get you to listen what's the consequence of that of the room. We first have to understand that this input filter, like the way we equalize ourselves against the room, is always position related. That means that what I'm projecting into the room won't be the same thing if I'm in one location or another. That's why the distance of your speakers from the wall, from the back wall, affect a lot what's going to be canceled and what's going to get some reflections and what kind of filtering will you get from the speaker itself. So if this is generating an impulse into the room and it's going to reverberate inside of the room, it's really important to think of this distance inside of the room. And also the amount of walls that are relatively close to the object or the thing that's creating the impulse inside of the room, because it's not the same having one single wall versus 2 walls versus 3 walls, because you get increases of 6 dBs on the low end. And this is important because this first input filter has to do with how are we interacting with the room first relative to our position and what's closest to us. So it's not the same to record vocals near a glass as recording vocals near an absorber panel, right? That has a lot to do with it. And of course, this first filter will also be affected by something like the source itself. It's not the same having these 3-way speakers as having a harp, as having a clap, as having vocals, as having drums. So this first filter, in my head, or conceptually, what you have to understand is that it's determined by the position and the source itself. That's why something like the chamber reverbs might use different set of speakers in different locations of the room with a specific set of microphones, but that happens a lot later in time. We're only talking about how we are stimulating the room, how we are creating that first impulse that's going to create the reverb. And this is the first step. Then we have these early reflections. This happens usually for acoustics definitions within the first 20 to 60 milliseconds even. So anything that bounces, for example, from your speakers into your desk and to your ears, that's within the first 20 milliseconds to 60 milliseconds, could be considered an early reflection. In this plugin by Hoffa, the IQ Reverb, we can actually see this manipulation much more visually. So when I'm assigning something like the Predelay, this is the most important concept for me when trying to understand reverb. Predelay means how long will it take for you to listen to the first reflection inside of the room. And this is really important because this is what will give us the sense of something being much more realistic and part of the size of the room and the distance from the room. So if the speed of sound at more or less 20 degrees Celsius is 344 meters per second, so that means that in 10 milliseconds, if we match that number of 344 meters per second, the sound is going to go at 3 meters every 10 milliseconds, right? So these first 10 milliseconds would mean 3 meters, 6 meters, 9 meters, right? It's really important for us to understand why does that have a consequence on the space we are actually creating, and it really varies on what kind of material we're working with. If you're working only with samples, trust me, this is still important, but especially if you're working with microphones and recorded instruments, this is extremely much more important. So if we start with something like that, we can also remember this small concept that's called the Haas Effect, right? The Haas Effect is the time frame under which our listening threshold can usually detect something as two different sounds. It's more or less, it's not precisely a number because it varies person by person. It's more or less 25 milliseconds on an average person. It can usually go down easily to 20 milliseconds. On a little bit better trained ears, it can go down to 15, 13, maybe 12 milliseconds. And of course, the closer it is, or the shorter that number is, it can probably start sounding much more as some sort of phasing effect, like this high comp filtering effect, instead of two hits like tak tak, right? It's going to sound like a flammed, like a flammed hit of any sort. When you do, if you hit your hand with fingers like one after the other, you can probably start feeling that effect, or there are so many ways to recreate it, or in the DAW and just displacing a certain amount of milliseconds, and you can recreate that effect. But for me, that's why the predelay, or the predelay, however it's said in English, is the most important parameter to know how to set, because everything else works around it. There are a couple of suggestions that I might want to do. For example, use low predelays if you're using drums into that specific reverb, unless you want that result as a delay, as another hit completely. Remember that you always have this musical equivalence of that timing. So if we go into 16th notes at something like 100 BPM, we see that it's 150 milliseconds. And if we go back to every 10 milliseconds is 3.44 meters, we will see that this is 51 meters. And that's crazy. Like, that's a really, really crazy number. So if we go down to 64, we'll see this is barely 37, and 128 is 18 milliseconds, right? So trust me, predelay is really, really important. So maybe think about the predelay as something that really separates the signal from the actual dry sound, and this can have different impacts on the sound that you're dealing with. It can really push the sound to the back if you make that predelay super close, because it doesn't have enough direct sound, because that's the proper name of this first stage of sound. That's a direct sound. Then we have the early reflections. And since you have enough early reflections, the brain understands that and pushes the sound back, right? Because it's listening to reflections of walls and glasses and floors and ceilings and whatnot. And of course, there's a relationship on all of the comp filtering that will happen in that small time frame of 20 to 60 milliseconds, whatever your predelay is. And that comp filtering might even sound as some sort of chorus-like effect. And that's why some plugins might have something like spin or chorus-related names that have to do with how much of this you want it to be, because that's how reflective the first surface is. And the rate is, of course, how high is that speed of bouncing from one wall to another. So if you think of being on a really narrow hall, like this 2 people narrow hall that's super high reflection of a hospital or some sort of bathroom or stairway that's really, really, really narrow, but it's highly reflective, you end up listening to this chorus-like effect. It doesn't have this pitch modulation effect as the chorus does, but it's not a flanger and it's not a phaser. It's closer to a chorus. And of course, some plugins might have some extra knobs to let you choose the dampening of these early reflections, and that's how quick the high end will drop or how much of the low end you will get in absorption. So now that we have pretty much understood the basics of the difference between the direct sound and what happens during the first reflections or the early reflections, because remember, this would be your pre-delay, and then everything that happens between early reflections and how you EQ yourself or the source against the room, is going to create a diffused sound, right? Everything after this is called diffused sound. So everything in the diffused sound is all of this decay that you can see in this waterfall diagram. And this is a frequency analysis in a waterfall scheme where you can see how much does the low end take to dampen or to fall or the high end. And this is completely related to the characteristics of the room. So it depends if it's shiny or if it's not too shiny. Or if it's going to really, really make the sound last a lot longer. So if we start listening to something like a snare in the same room but moving the pre-delay, 30 milliseconds, it's already sounding like a double hit. 70-ish, 140, like that's a lot. Like that's a lot of delay, right? And remember, there's always some sort of equivalence, equal, you know what I mean, related to music. So if I want to make something like a 16th note in 100 BPM, I need to use 150. And I wouldn't fine tune to the super millisecond everything. It might take a lot of the realistic side of it out of the equation, but it's close enough for you to listen it out and try to figure out what's the best feeling that you want for that pre-delay. Because then you have to consider all of the decay time of this diffuse sound. If this decay time makes this 150 go into, I don't know, 2 bars, it might make sense, but if it goes down long, an eighth dotted note, it's going to create another feeling, and it has something to do with this pre-delay because it's where it's starting and how it starts to interact with the rest of the music that's still playing. I hope that made sense. So, when we go into this thing that's called the diffusion network, that's what I'm talking about when I'm trying to say that this is the whole EQ of the room, like the whole materials of the room. If you have a ton of carpets, or if you have a ton of wood, if you have a ton of glass, concrete, or whatever surface it might be, this is going to be really, really important. And as you can see in this stock Ableton plugin, you only have a high shelf and a low shelf. But you could even increase this EQ in the middle of the plugin itself, or some plugins, and you can see how I'm shaping the waterfall and making it null out or intensify and create some extra reflections and create the notes of the rooms themselves, of these acoustic notes, remember? So I could clean up a lot of my reverb, as you can see, by cleaning up all of the low end, keeping up some of the mids, and working on the highs. But again, I could just try and even it out and get some results that sounds best for me. Like whatever reverb you want to build, right? So all of those characteristics that you're listening after that pre-delay, remember that usually belong to the room itself, and most of the times you have some sort of way of EQing every single part of it in this plugin that I really, really love when I'm trying to recreate some precise reverbs so I can fix some bad recordings or create fake rooms. I can change the time parameter of my whole reverb in 3 bands, and I can even change the crossover of this, and it's a lot easier to work like this, right? Because I'm thinking specifically of a context. So I can work with all of the parameters. Okay, so this also interacts with what we are already listening straight from the instrument itself. Let's suppose that you're listening to the instrument itself inside of the room, or the first reflections, and this will also create some sort of comp filtering or chorus effect, right? In a lot of plugins, you will probably end up having something like stereo, right? Some stereo width knob. And in this case, density and flat and cut have to do with, again, EQ parameters and how fast the high-end decays and the dampening effect of the room itself. And in the case of the way the Ableton Live Reverb stock plugin does it, is that you have this diffuse knob that has to do with all of the level of your early reflections. And you have this reflect knob that has to do with all of the sound of your early reflections. And you have this diffused sound level where you have all of this diffusion network control. In the case of the IQ Reverb, I also have both of those. In this case, it's named Reverb Tail and Early Reflections. So even if I change one or the other, or I turn off Early Reflections, or I only keep the Reverb Tail, what's interesting here is that I could use the early reflections of one reverb and combine it with the tail of another one, and just balance that out. There are a ton of effects that you can build using these concepts. You can also just keep working with your presets that you already like, but if you want to start listening a lot more deeper in what you're moving and how you're affecting the sound, you have to start trying this stuff out. And in the end, the whole thing with reverb is that it's not only being created, but it has to be recaptured or listened at some point inside of the room itself, right? Because let's suppose we created the sound in this corner and we are capturing it mono completely here, because not everything needs to be stereo. Get over it. It doesn't have to be everything. Not everything has to be stereo. Just get over it. It really doesn't. Some things benefit from it, some things don't, and it has to do with contrast. So in this plugin, when I hit this snare, I hear the reverb right at the center. And since it's more or less at the middle of the room, I'm going to get a certain amount of high end, because that's also something that tells us how far or how close something is. Because if I move it to the back or to the front, you can listen to that high end moving around. And the low end also varies a little bit, but the low end, remember, loses energy a lot slower than high end information or higher frequencies. And higher frequencies are a lot more directional. So it's not the same to have it here but you could capture this in stereo. And maybe make it as narrow as you want. So this is really interesting. Let's start making it happen inside of different sounds. The concept, like the whole concept, is already there. Like you already understood it. Remember that you first have some stage where we are filtering ourselves, not only because of our relative position inside of the room, but by the source itself and how we modify it. So if you're playing a guitar with your fingers, it's not the same as playing it with, it's not, I have an even technique. I love it. Woo! It's not the same projection of the sound. And the early reflections is this affection of the sound that happens between the first 20 milliseconds all the way to 60 milliseconds. 20 milliseconds because remember we have this Haas Effect time frame that is more or less 20 milliseconds. So it can go a little bit lower, it can go a little bit higher, but it has to do with that number. And then the diffusion or the diffused sound has to do with everything after that. And that's what we usually also call the RT60, the reverb time 60, because how long does it take for the sound inside of the room to decay 60 decibels? That's why it's called RT60. And usually the decay knobs or parameters in your plugins are making a reference straight into that parameter. So unless if you have enough dynamic range on your mix and you can listen to stuff that's more or less 60 dB under, or a specific section of your song where you drop that much, remember that you will always have this diffused sound building up down here. Okay, it's a ton of information. I hope you're still here. Let's try to listen to this. So for example, with this path-like instrument, I'm going to use a very specific reverb, and that's going to be long enough, and I have a lot of this extra low end that I might not need. And from my plugin itself, I can filter it out. It's really important for you to clean up some of your reverbs, and at least most of your reverbs, so it doesn't build up way too much. So one of the ways to test your reverbs is you have to use something really short and hit play and stop. And that's what's going to give you how the decay is actually sounding, what it might be adding extra to your sound. If I make it a lot longer, see, I have this resonance down here. So I can shorten that. And this works great. Like this is a great way of handling it. Maybe if my direct sound is already really stereo, I might want to just completely fill my left to right stereo field. So this for me sounds fuller, but it doesn't have to do only with EQ. It has to do with how much is it occupying in my stereo width. Because I could always carve out a little bit of a specific frequency that I feel it's bulking up. And for me, that's still a lot fuller because it has to do with how much is it occupying within my stereo available space. Most of the time, something like pads and such won't suffer too much if you add some predelay, unless the harmonic movement might have some consequences. Like that's the only thing I would worry about. So something like this, a wood block, that a lot of people would only load some supermassive, and that's this super long reverb delay effect. If we analyze this plugin from the same anatomic structure of what I already showed you, we can see that we always have this first predelay time, then we have this modulation of what's happening with the repetitions inside of the room, or how is it being affected. Strange for me in the signal flow order is for me to have the width at first, because this could mean that I am inverting L and R going into the processor, or I could be inverting L and R going out of the processor, right? And it's not the same result. It's completely not the same result. And that's something I play a lot with some of my delay plugins, where I have my input from the left going into the left, not cross-fitting, and then going out into the right channel. And the right channel going in only through the right and going into the left. But if I cross-fit a little bit of that, and I add enough feedback, I can get some interesting repetitions, right? So it's not exactly the same having it at the input or the output. Then this feedback is not necessarily a reverb parameter. It has to do with delay, because the room itself won't feedback itself into it. It doesn't happen. Density, again, as you can see in the description down below, it usually talks about something that's related to the dampening of the room or how dense the repetitions are, so we perceive them more as so many delays that are so much more some kind of reverb and not separate delays, right? And again, another modulation stage that could be chorus-like or might have any other sort of effect. And you could also have some EQ on the output of the plugin itself. So instead of having something like this, I could build something like that using just simple plugins. I know this one is complex, but I could build something like that. For example, I could feed a delay into this reverb, and then after this reverb, add some modulation plugin that acts as this extra modulation. Even though this plugin is really, really complete and I have this modulation section right here, super low. We will listen to this also with some harmonic content, because there's so much noise in the source of a snare that it probably isn't as clear for everyone. So if we position that repetition inside of any room, and if we launch that small wood block, I could have some really interesting sounds. Can you listen how around here it even feels like a higher pitch? Remember that if you hold Command or Control on PC and Shift, you can set your effects offline on Reverb, so they are not using any extra CPU processing for any reason whatsoever. So if we have this Rhodes sample, completely dry, and I can listen that it already has this Leslie effect. So for something like this, I might want to try some longer reverb, around maybe 2.5 or something like that. And just from the diagram, I can see that it's going to be probably way too resonant. So I'll try something else, maybe something like this. And I can actually listen to the direct sound at the very center of it, and then the room itself is amplifying the sound. Reverb is acting as a magnifying glass always, because whatever you input into it will get a lot more frequencies across all of the frequency spectrum and across time. That's a really important consequence when talking about reverb. It's not just more of the low end because it has a room mode resonating, or more of the any end. It's also making the sound and the instrument last longer, and that might have some musical feeling consequences that have nothing to do with having the precise milliseconds of the eighth note. So if I want to affect first more or less what's going into it, I could set this up as an auxiliary reverb, and I'm just going to make another track right here. I'm going to name it IQ Reverb. I'm going to make a new track here. I'm going to copy my reverb. I'm going to raise this one by holding Option, and I'm going to use this action rename select tracks as first effects. So it's IQ Reverb. I'll just drag, create a send, open my plugin, and now I have it on a separate track, right? I can go 100% wet. And now anything that I do before this, anything I do before my reverb will affect what's going into my reverb itself. So maybe I want to cut a little bit here and maybe I want to cut a little bit there, and I want to really stimulate that high end so it gets a lot more presence inside of my session or sound, music, sound, whatever. Perfect, I love it. So maybe I want to start playing around with Predelay, and maybe something like 75 might work. But again, if we go back to the idea that every 10 milliseconds is 3.44 meters, I might want to go a lot shorter, because unless I'm recording the Leslie from really far away, this number might not work. And I want to get as close as possible to that phasing sound, but not to be phasey. And I like more or less that range. I'm not going to go deep into it, but I like that range. And since I'm still listening to a lot of the direct sound right in the middle of my speakers, I might want to do something like an auto panner. You can copy these settings if you like them. And this is going to pan the sound before going into the reverb. And let me show it off. You are only listening to the reverb with the panning. I'm going to make it move a little bit faster. And I just want to make it super obvious so you know how it's moving and how it's affecting the reverb. And without this panning, the reverb, right? So I might want to narrow down a little bit how much the panning goes, because if it goes way too hard into the left side, all of my reverb will get really to the left side, right? So I could fix that by setting up the position of the recording of my reverb, stereo. And that's definitely helping a lot, but I just don't want it to be super, super wide. So I could play around with it, have fun with it, have fun with setting up the ranges of that. But again, I'm going to slowly start bringing back up the original sound. And of course, as I said, we could have some sort of modulation. I'm going to use something that I really love, that I have a video on it. If you want to go check it out, that's called Choric. And I love this plugin. So maybe I want to use some sort of low pass, and I want to add this shimmer effect to the reverb. So I'm going to pitch up the Choric repetitions. And probably something like this. And I think that sounds interesting. So I think you're getting more or less the idea of what actually belongs to the reverb itself, and how many plugins just add parameters that don't necessarily belong to the reverb, but are affecting the sound because you have modulation and effect knobs and stuff happening under the hood. In the case of something like drums, it's really interesting because I see a lot of people just adding reverb to the snare, right? And if we use something like Eventide's SP 2016 that I really, really like, we could make this snare go into a reverb plate and just modify a little bit of Predelay and change the decay time. Decay plate reverbs don't have way too many parameters, but I have to make a different video on all of the types of reverbs. Don't worry, it will be coming up next week. But I want to really just nail down the basic concepts of what's going on inside of a reverb. And what I'm adding is this mid-rangey and lower mids range to the sound of my snare. If I want a much higher sound of it, I might throw that reverb into some sort of hall. And why not use an emulation of the 480 by Lexicon? That's one of the units that I learned on, where you have this filter at the input, you have the reverb time, but again, like I'm always thinking about the order of the parameters and the order of the controls. So why the hell is my Predelay almost at the end, since it's the first thing that I should be moving? So first I will set up my Predelay, then I will set up my filtering that I'm not sure if this is output or input, and then I'm going to set up some reverb time, right? I'm going to move into a hole. I'm going to make it super long. I think you have the basics to understand more or less reverb. So if you're trying to throw reverb or add reverb to some sample bass drums, you could add some real-life sensation to it. I have a whole video on this much more advanced technique of how to manipulate reverb that I will link in the description and how to try and create this room. But sometimes I think that people, when they are using or making sample-based music, they are using reverb either more of as a glue, so everything feels more part of the same space, or they're using it more as a tone shaper because it's more about what it adds to the sound than how does it make the continuous space where everything was recorded part of it, or how is it making up, as in makeup, some of the harshness of the room itself or the placement inside of the room itself. I hope this video has been useful for you. I love this subject. I really, really enjoy listening to reverb and understanding what's going on step by step. I have a Buy Me a Coffee link down below. If you feel like this helped you in any way, I'd really appreciate if you go and help with any amount. I would really appreciate it. And if you like this kind of videos, be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and do all of those things that people on YouTube say. Straight from Mexico City, my name is Juanchis, and thanks for listening.